Margaret Ellison stood outside the glass doors of Verriott, the most exclusive boutique on Fifth Avenue, wearing a faded denim jacket and sneakers that had seen better days. She had walked past this store 100 times in the 3 years she'd lived in New York, always glancing at the window displays the way someone glances at a painting in a museum they're not allowed to touch. Today, for the first time, she was going to walk inside. She wasn't going in to buy anything. She couldn't afford so much as a scarf from a place like Verriott. She was going in because her sister-in-law, Cassidy, had dared her to do it, half as a joke and half as a test, the way people who have never known real hardship sometimes test those who have. "Just go in and look around, Jan," Cassidy had said over coffee the day before, swirling her drink with a manicured nail. "See how long it takes them to throw you out." Margaret hadn't wanted to do it, but something stubborn in her chest, some old wound from years of being underestimated, made her push open the heavy door anyway. The boutique smelled like white tea and money. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen rain, and the floors gleamed so brightly Margaret could see her own reflection staring back, looking smaller than she felt. A saleswoman in a black sheath dress glided toward her, with the practiced smile of someone who had already decided, in the span of 2 seconds, that Margaret did not belong. "Can I help you find something?" the woman asked, in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Just looking," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. The saleswoman's eyes flicked over her jacket, her sneakers, the canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder that still had a coffee stain from a shift 2 days earlier. "Of course," she said, and then, lower, to a colleague passing by, "Watch the handbags." Margaret felt her face go hot, but she didn't leave. She walked deeper into the store, past racks of cashmere sweaters that cost more than her monthly rent, past a display of handbags locked behind glass like museum relics. She told herself she didn't care what these people thought of her. She told herself this was just a dare, a silly errand to prove a point to Cassidy, who thought Margaret was too sensitive about money, too quick to feel small in rooms like this. But the truth was more complicated, and it always had been. 3 years ago, Margaret Ellison had been someone else entirely. She had grown up in a sprawling house in Connecticut, the daughter of a man who had built and lost 2 fortunes before she turned 25. She remembered private school uniforms and summer homes on the Cape, remembered a closet full of dresses she never wore twice. And then, the year she turned 26, her father's second company collapsed under the weight of bad investments and worse partners, and everything she had known evaporated in the span of 8 months. The house was sold. The cars were repossessed. Her father, broken by shame, had a heart attack in his sleep less than a year later, and her mother, who had never worked a day in her life, was left with nothing but grief and a stack of unpaid bills. Margaret had moved to New York with 2 suitcases and a determination that nobody ever again would see her cry over money. She worked as a hostess at a mid-priced restaurant in Murray Hill, picked up shifts at a coffee shop on weekends, and told almost no one about the life she used to have. It was easier that way. Pity was its own kind of poverty, and she'd had enough of both. She was running her fingers lightly along a rack of silk blouses, lost in thought, when she heard the saleswoman's voice rise sharply behind her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the merchandise." Margaret turned. 2 more employees had appeared, flanking the first woman, their expressions arranged into a kind of polite hostility that made Margaret's stomach twist. A small crowd of customers had paused their own shopping to watch, the way people slow down to watch a car accident. "I haven't touched anything," Margaret said. "We've had issues before with people coming in just to—" The saleswoman paused delicately, as if choosing a word that wouldn't get her sued. "Browse, this is a private appointment boutique. I think you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Heat crawled up Margaret's neck and into her cheeks. She thought about leaving, about swallowing the humiliation the way she'd swallowed so many others since her family's collapse. But some stubborn ember in her refused to fully die. "I'm allowed to look at clothes in a store," she said, quieter than she intended, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. "Is there a problem here?" The voice came from the entrance, low and even, carrying an unmistakable authority that made every employee in the store straighten as if a string had been pulled tight through their spines. Margaret turned, along with everyone else, to see a tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepping through the doors, his dark hair slightly windblown, his expression unreadable. Margaret's heart stopped. It was Nathaniel Cross. She knew his face the way most of New York knew his face, from magazine covers, from business headlines, from the kind of hushed reverence people used when they spoke about men who built empires from nothing. Cross capital, self-made, worth, depending on which article you read, somewhere between $4 and $6 billion. Margaret had served him coffee exactly once, 8 months ago, at the little shop near his office, and he had tipped generously and said thank you in a way that made her feel, for 30 seconds, like a person instead of furniture. She hadn't expected him to remember her. There was no reason he should. But he was looking directly at her now, and something in his expression had shifted, recognition, sharp and sudden, crossing his features like a current. "Mr. Cross," the saleswoman said, her voice transforming instantly into honeyed warmth, the kind reserved for billionaires and royalty. "We're so sorry for the wait. Your appointment is ready in the private suite." "I asked," Nathaniel said, cutting through her pleasantries without raising his voice, "if there was a problem." The saleswoman's smile faltered. "We were just explaining to this customer that—" "This customer," Nathaniel said, walking forward until he stood beside Margaret, close enough that she could smell cedar and something faintly like rain, "is my wife." The words landed in the boutique like a dropped glass. Margaret turned to him, certain she had misheard, certain the air conditioning or the shock of the moment had scrambled something in her brain. But Nathaniel wasn't looking at her with confusion or apology for the strange lie he had just told in front of a room full of strangers. He was looking at her the way a man looks at someone he has been waiting a long time to find again, his dark eyes steady, almost daring her to contradict him. The saleswoman's face had gone the color of the marble floor. Your wife, sir." "My wife," Nathaniel repeated, and then, turning his gaze fully on the woman who had nearly thrown Margaret out onto the sidewalk, he added, "I'd like to speak to your manager. Now." Margaret stood frozen between the racks of silk and cashmere, her heart hammering, utterly unable to understand what was happening, or why a man worth billions of dollars had just claimed her as his own in front of half of Fifth Avenue. The manager arrived within 90 seconds, a thin man in his 50s with the harried expression of someone who had been summoned by an emergency he didn't yet understand. By then, Nathaniel had steered Margaret gently by the elbow toward a quiet corner near the fitting rooms, away from the cluster of stunned employees and the handful of customers who were now pretending very hard not to stare. "What are you doing?" Margaret whispered, the moment they were out of earshot. "Why would you say that?" "Because they were about to call security on you for the crime of wearing sneakers," Nathaniel said. His voice was calm, but there was something tight beneath it, something that looked almost like anger, though not directed at her. "I watched the whole thing happen before I even walked through the door. The glass front of this place isn't as private as they think it is. That doesn't mean you had to lie." "It wasn't entirely a lie," he said, and there was the faintest maddening curve at the corner of his mouth. "I've thought about you since the coffee shop. I came in here today because I remembered you worked 2 blocks from here, and I thought, foolishly, that maybe I'd run into you on the street someday. I didn't expect to find you defending yourself against a saleswoman with main character syndrome." Margaret didn't know whether to laugh or to be furious. The truth was she felt both at once, swirling together until they made something entirely new, a kind of dizzy disbelief that made the chandeliers above her seem to spin slightly. "You remembered me. It's been 8 months. You gave me extra foam on my coffee even though I didn't ask for it, because you said I looked like I'd had a hard morning," he said. "Nobody at Cross Capital has been honest with me about how I look in over a decade." I remembered. Before Margaret could respond, the manager reached them, his hands clasped in front of him in an attitude of pure damage control. "Mr. Cross, I am so deeply sorry for any misunderstanding. Ms." He glanced at Margaret, clearly unsure what surname to use. "Cross, please accept our sincerest apologies. The employee in question will be spoken to immediately." "She won't just be spoken to," Nathaniel said. "She'll be retrained properly on how to treat every single person who walks through that door, regardless of what they're wearing." Verriott does over $400,000 a year in business with my company alone, for gifts and corporate events. I'd hate to have to reconsider that relationship over an employee who can't tell the difference between a customer and a threat. The manager went pale and began apologizing again, more frantically this time, but Margaret had stopped listening. She was watching Nathaniel's face, trying to reconcile the cold, commanding businessman currently dismantling the manager's composure with the quiet, almost shy man who had ordered black coffee with extra foam every morning for 2 weeks straight, who had once left a $100 bill in the tip jar and walked out before she could say anything. When the manager finally retreated, practically bowing as he went, Nathaniel turned back to Margaret, and the hardness in his expression melted into something softer. "Let me buy you lunch," he said. "Properly, not pretending to be married, just lunch, so I can apologize for putting you in an even stranger position than the one you were already in." Margaret hesitated. Every practical instinct in her told her this was a bad idea, that men like Nathaniel Cross did not have lunch with hostesses from Murray Hill, that whatever spark of interest he felt was likely a passing curiosity that would fade the moment he remembered who she really was, or rather, who she no longer was. But there was something in his eyes that reminded her painfully of the life she used to have before everything collapsed, a kind of ease, a confidence that came from never having to wonder whether you belonged in a room. "Lunch?" she said finally. "But you're not buying me a coat to replace this one. I like my jacket." "I wouldn't dream of it," he said. And the smile that broke across his face was unlike anything Margaret had seen in the magazines. Unguarded, almost boyish, the smile of a man caught off guard by his own happiness. They walked 3 blocks to a small Italian restaurant that Nathaniel swore wasn't owned by anyone he knew, which turned out to be true, and which Margaret suspected was the first time in years he had eaten anywhere that didn't require a reservation, made weeks in advance. Over plates of cacio e pepe, the conversation unspooled easily, far more easily than Margaret expected. Nathaniel asked about her family, and she gave him the careful, edited version she gave everyone. Her parents were gone. She'd moved to the city for a fresh start. She liked it well enough. She didn't mention Connecticut, or the house with the wraparound porch, or her father's face the last time she saw him alive, grey and defeated at the kitchen table with bankruptcy papers spread out like a losing hand of cards. In turn, Nathaniel told her things that surprised her, that his father had been a long-haul truck driver who died when Nathaniel was 19, that he'd built Cross Capital out of a one-room office above a laundromat in Queens, that despite the billions, he still couldn't bring himself to throw away a pair of work boots that had belonged to his father, even though they sat unused in his closet for 15 years. "People assume I was born into this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the air, at the city, at the version of himself that appeared in magazines. "It's easier to hate someone if you think they never struggled." "I don't hate you," Margaret said quietly. "I just don't understand why someone like you would care what happened to someone like me in a boutique." "Someone like you," Nathaniel repeated, leaning forward slightly. "What does that mean exactly?" Margaret looked down at her plate, suddenly unsure how to answer, without revealing more than she intended. "Someone who works 2 jobs. Someone who doesn't belong in stores like that." "You belonged in that store as much as anyone else who walked through the door," he said, his voice firm. "Maybe more, honestly, because you didn't flinch, even when they tried to make you feel small. I watched you stand your ground before I even said a word. That's not nothing, Margaret." It was the first time he'd said her name, and something about hearing it in his voice made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years, not since before everything fell apart, back when she still believed that good things could happen to her without warning, without a catch. They talked for 2 hours, long past when the espresso cups had gone cold, and when Nathaniel finally asked for her number, Margaret gave it to him without the hesitation she expected to feel. As they stood to leave, he held the door for her, and for a moment on the sidewalk outside the little restaurant, the late afternoon light caught his face in a way that made him look less like a billionaire and more like a man who had simply gotten lucky in love twice in one day. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "Soon, if that's all right." "It's all right," Margaret said. She didn't tell him as they parted ways at the corner that her hands were shaking, Not from nerves, but from the strange, frightening hope blooming in her chest, a hope she had buried so deep 3 years ago that she'd nearly forgotten what it felt like. She didn't tell him that the last man who had looked at her the way he just had was someone from her old life, someone who had vanished the moment her family's money did, proving to her once and for all that affection built on circumstance was no affection at all. What Margaret didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known, standing on that sidewalk with her heart hammering and the city humming gold around her, was that Nathaniel Cross had recognized far more about her than just her face from a coffee shop counter, and that recognition, when it finally surfaced, would threaten to unravel everything between them before it had even truly begun. 3 weeks passed, and in that time, Margaret's life folded quietly around the edges of Nathaniel's. They met for coffee before her morning shifts, for dinner after her evening ones, for long walks through Central Park where he wore baseball caps and sunglasses in a half-hearted attempt to avoid being recognized, an attempt that worked perhaps half the time. He never made her feel like her 2 jobs were something to apologize for. He never once mentioned money, except to ask, genuinely curious, what it had been like growing up in a household where her father worked with his hands. She lied about that too, the way she'd been lying since the day she arrived in New York. Her father had never worked with his hands. He had worked in finance, the same world Nathaniel now ruled. And he had lost everything because of decisions not so different from the ones men like Nathaniel made every day. Margaret told herself the omission was small, harmless, a private detail that had nothing to do with what was growing between them. But the lie sat in her chest like a stone she kept swallowing, heavier each time. It was Cassidy who finally cracked the dam, though not on purpose. They were having coffee again, the same kind of coffee that had started this whole strange chapter of Margaret's life, when Cassidy set down her cup and said, almost offhandedly, "I heard something weird yesterday from my friend Brianna, who works in PR. She said Nathaniel Cross has been asking around about you." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Asking around how?" "Like background check, asking around." Brianna said someone from his office called a contact at a Society magazine archive, trying to find old photos of a family named Ellison from Connecticut. Apparently there was a profile years ago on a guy named Richard Ellison, some finance guy who went bankrupt and died. Brianna thought it was a coincidence until she put together that Ellison is your last name. The coffee shop noise around Margaret seemed to recede into a dull roar. "Richard Ellison was my father," she said quietly. Cassidy's eyes widened. "Wait, you're that Ellison family? The ones with the house in Greenwich that got auctioned off?" Margaret hadn't said the word Greenwich out loud in 3 years. Hearing it now, in the middle of a crowded coffee shop, felt like being unzipped from the inside. "I never told Nathaniel," she admitted. "He thinks my dad drove trucks or something. I let him believe it because it was easier. Because I didn't want him to think I was after his money or that I understood his world better than I let on." Margaret. Cassidy's voice had gone serious in a way it rarely did. "If he's having his people dig into your background, he's going to find out everything. The bankruptcy, the lawsuits, all of it. And he's going to find out you lied to him about who you are." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since she moved in, and tried to convince herself that Cassidy's information was wrong or exaggerated or simply gossip filtered through too many hands to be trusted. But a cold certainty had settled into her, the kind of certainty that comes from years of watching things fall apart and learning to recognize the signs before they finish collapsing. She didn't have to wait long to find out the truth. 2 days later, Nathaniel asked her to dinner at his penthouse for the first time. Not a restaurant, not a public outing, but his actual home, the one she'd seen photographed in magazines but never imagined she would enter. She told herself this was a good sign, an intimacy he was finally ready to offer her. She didn't yet understand that he had a different reason for wanting privacy that night. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building overlooking the park. All glass and dark wood, and a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of luxury. Nathaniel greeted her warmly, kissed her cheek, poured her a glass of wine, and for the first 20 minutes everything felt almost normal. Then he led her into his study, where a single folder sat closed on the desk, and Margaret's stomach dropped before he even spoke. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to be honest with me because I think you haven't been." Margaret's mouth went dry. "Nathaniel, your father was Richard Ellison," he said, not unkindly, but with a directness that left no room to maneuver. "He ran Ellison Premier Investments. He lost almost $40 million of investor money in 2019 before the firm collapsed, and he died of a heart attack 5 months later. Your family lost the house in Greenwich. You told me he drove trucks." The silence that followed felt endless. Margaret felt heat rising behind her eyes, the particular humiliation of being caught in a lie she'd told so many times it had almost become true in her own mind. "I told you that because I didn't want you to know," she said finally, her voice cracking. "I didn't want you to look at me and see another rich girl who lost her money and is now slumming it for sympathy, or worse, see me as someone trying to claw her way back into that world through you." "Is that what this is?" Nathaniel's voice was quiet, careful, but there was real hurt underneath it. "Are you with me because of what I have?" "No." The word came out fierce, immediate. "God, no. If anything, I've spent the last 3 years running from people who think money is the only thing worth having. I wanted just once for someone to like me, without knowing any of it, without the weight of what my family used to be or what we lost, or any of it. I wanted to be someone new." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, turning his wineglass slowly in his hand. "Do you know why I had someone look into your background?" he asked finally. "It wasn't suspicion. It was something else. My investment fund handled some of the cleanup after Ellison Premier collapsed. We bought distressed assets from your father's portfolio, properties that had been seized, including, as it turns out, the house in Greenwich." Margaret stared at him, the room tilting slightly. "You own my parents' house?" "My company does. It's been sitting in our real estate division for 3 years, unsold, because of some zoning dispute with the township that's tied it up in litigation." He set down his glass. "I didn't know any of that when I met you at the coffee shop, Margaret. I swear to you I had no idea who you were, but when my team flagged the connection last week, I didn't know how to bring it up. I was afraid you'd think I had some kind of agenda. And clearly," he added, his voice softening, "you were afraid of something similar from me." Margaret felt tears she hadn't expected gathering at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer dizzying strangeness of the coincidence, the way the past kept circling back no matter how far she ran from it. "I haven't seen that house in 3 years, she whispered. "I used to think about it all the time, the porch, my mother's garden. I used to dream about it and wake up so angry I couldn't breathe." Nathaniel crossed the room and took her hands in his expression earnest, almost desperate in its sincerity. "I'm not telling you this to upset you. I'm telling you because I think there's something we could do about it. Something that might actually give you back a piece of what you lost. But I need you to trust me first. Completely. The way I'm choosing to trust you. No more half-truths between us. Not about your father, not about the house, not about anything." Margaret looked up at him, this man who had walked into her life through a boutique door and somehow, impossibly, connected himself to every loose thread of her past, and felt something shift inside her, not fear this time, but a fragile, dangerous hope. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. Nathaniel's eyes held hers, steady and certain. "I want to buy the house back," he said. "Not for me, for you, if you'll let me." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, certain she had misheard. "You want to buy back my parents' house?" "I want to give it to you," Nathaniel corrected gently. "There's a difference. I'm not interested in handing you a gift that makes you feel indebted to me, or like I'm trying to buy my way into your trust. I'm talking about something else, a partnership maybe. Or—" He hesitated, choosing his words with unusual care for a man who normally spoke with total confidence. "A foundation, built around what your father's collapse taught both of us. I've spent the last decade in finance watching firms like his go under, watching families lose everything, because of decisions made by people who never had to live with the consequences. I think there's something meaningful we could build out of that house, not just a home, a second chance visible to anyone who drives past it." Margaret sat down slowly on the leather sofa near the window, the lights of the park glittering below them like scattered coins. Her mind moved too quickly to land on any single thought. Grief for her father, who would never see this moment. Anger at the unfairness of a system that had crushed him and elevated men like Nathaniel in the same motion. And underneath all of it, a small, stubborn flicker of something that felt dangerously close to relief. "I need to think," she said finally. "This is a lot. Nathaniel. 3 weeks ago I was getting kicked out of a boutique. Now you're telling me you own my childhood home and want to turn it into some kind of, a charity?" "A resource center," he said, "for families going through financial collapse. Free legal counsel, credit rebuilding programs, grief counseling for the kind of loss that doesn't get talked about because people are ashamed of it. I lost my father to exhaustion, and a body that gave out from decades of 14-hour shifts behind a wheel. You lost yours to bankruptcy and shame. Different causes, same kind of grief. I think there's room in that house for both." Margaret felt tears slide down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was the strange, overwhelming sensation of watching something broken being handled with unexpected care, of watching a stranger understand a wound she had spent 3 years hiding from everyone, including herself. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked. "You didn't know me a month ago." Nathaniel sat beside her, close but not touching, giving her the space she needed. "Because the day I met you at that coffee shop, you were the only person who'd looked at me like an actual human being in longer than I could remember. Everyone else sees the number next to my name. You gave me extra foam because I looked tired. That's it. That's the whole reason I remembered you for 8 months." He paused. "And because watching you stand in that boutique, refusing to shrink even when they tried to make you small, reminded me of every single day my father came home exhausted and broke, and still held his head up at the dinner table like the world hadn't beaten him down. I don't get many chances to honor that. This felt like one." They sat in silence for a while, the city humming faintly below, and Margaret let herself, for the first time in years, simply feel the weight of everything she'd been carrying, instead of pretending it didn't exist. The weeks that followed moved quickly. Margaret visited the house in Greenwich for the first time in 3 years, standing on the cracked driveway where the moving trucks had once idled, staring up at the wraparound porch where her mother used to drink coffee every morning before the world fell apart. The garden had gone wild with neglect, roses tangled into thorny knots, but the bones of the house remained, sturdy and familiar, like an old friend who had simply been waiting. Her mother, who had moved into a modest apartment in Hartford after the collapse and rarely spoke about the past, cried when Margaret told her what Nathaniel proposed, not from sadness, but from a kind of disbelieving joy that Margaret hadn't seen in her mother's face in years. "Your father would have wanted this," she said, gripping Margaret's hands. "Not the house back for us. He'd have wanted it to help someone else. He used to say that losing everything taught him more about decency than having it ever did." It took 4 months of legal work, zoning negotiations, and careful planning before the Ellison Family Resource Center opened its doors in the house where Margaret had grown up. Nathaniel insisted on naming it after her family, not his own, despite funding nearly the entire renovation himself. The wraparound porch was restored. The garden was replanted, including a row of roses identical to the ones Margaret's mother used to grow. Inside, where Margaret's childhood bedroom had once been, there was now a quiet room with soft chairs and tissue boxes, where grief counselors met with families who had lost businesses, homes, and sometimes loved ones to the particular devastation of financial ruin. On opening day, Margaret stood on the porch steps in a simple green dress, watching cars line up along the street. Former neighbors, employees who had once worked for her father's firm, strangers who had read about the center in the local paper and come out of curiosity or need. Cassidy stood beside her, uncharacteristically quiet, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she pretended not to need. "I can't believe this is happening," Cassidy whispered. "You went from being thrown out of a boutique to cutting a ribbon in front of your old house. If I wrote this as fiction, nobody would believe it." Margaret laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "I wouldn't have believed it either." Nathaniel found her hand and squeezed it gently. He wore a simple grey suit, no tie, his sleeves rolled up in a way that made him look less like a billionaire and more like a man who had spent the morning helping carry chairs, which, in fact, he had. "Ready?" he asked. "Almost," Margaret said. She turned to him, the late afternoon sun catching gold in his dark hair, and felt the full dizzying weight of how far they had come from that cold marble floor on Fifth Avenue. "I need to tell you something first." Nathaniel's expression softened with curiosity, perhaps a flicker of concern. "What is it?" "I love you," Margaret said simply. "I haven't said it yet, and I should have, weeks ago. But I was scared. I spent so long protecting myself from people who only valued what I used to have, or what I could become again, that I forgot what it felt like to just be loved for exactly who I am, sneakers and coffee stains and all." She squeezed his hand. "So I love you. And I'm not scared to say it anymore." Something shifted in Nathaniel's face, a vulnerability rare for a man who built empires for a living, who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without his pulse changing. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough. "I think I started falling for you the moment you told me I looked like I'd had a hard morning, and you weren't even trying to flatter me. You were just being honest. I haven't had many people in my life who were simply honest with me, Margaret. You changed that." He reached into his jacket pocket then, and Margaret's breath caught as she realized what he was doing. He didn't kneel, not yet, he said later, laughing, because the porch steps were too crowded with reporters and well-wishers for the moment to feel private enough. But he opened a small velvet box and held it out to her, his hands steadier than she expected. "I'm not asking you this today, not really," he said. "I just wanted you to have it, here, in this house, on this day that means everything. When you're ready, whenever that is, I want to marry you. Not because of the house, not because of any of this. Because somewhere between a boutique and a coffee shop and a bankrupt family's old porch, you became the person I can't imagine my life without." Margaret looked down at the ring, simple and elegant, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry she'd glimpsed behind glass cases on Fifth Avenue, and felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsettled for 3 long years. "Yes," she said, before he'd even finished asking. "Whenever you're ready to ask properly, the answer is yes." The crowd, sensing something significant even from a distance, began to applaud, though most of them had no idea what they were celebrating. Cassidy was openly crying now, no longer pretending otherwise. Margaret's mother, standing near the restored rose garden, pressed a hand to her chest and smiled the way she hadn't smiled since before the collapse, since before grief had carved itself permanently into the lines of her face. 6 months later, Margaret Ellison married Nathaniel Cross on that same porch, beneath an arch of white roses grown from cuttings of her mother's original garden. She wore her grandmother's pearls instead of anything new, and Nathaniel wore his father's old leather work boots beneath his tailored suit, polished for the first time in 15 years, a quiet tribute to the man who had taught him that dignity had nothing to do with money. The Ellison Family Resource Center now operated in 12 cities across the country, each location funded in part by Cross Capital, each one named for a family that had lost everything and found, eventually, a way back to something whole. Margaret worked there 3 days a week, no longer hiding any part of her story, telling families who walked through the doors that collapse was not the end of the story, only a difficult chapter in the middle of it. Sometimes, in the quiet of early mornings, Margaret would think back to that day on Fifth Avenue, to the saleswoman's cold dismissal, to the humiliation that had nearly sent her running from the boutique in tears. She had walked in that day expecting nothing, prepared for nothing, certain that places like Verriott would never see her as anything but an inconvenience to be removed. She could never have imagined that the worst moment of that ordinary Tuesday would become, in time, the first page of the happiest chapter of her life. She thought, too, of her father, of the kitchen table where he'd once sat broken and ashamed, and wondered if some part of him knew, wherever he was, that his collapse had eventually become someone else's foundation. She liked to believe he did. She liked to believe that the porch where she now sat each evening, Nathaniel's hand in hers, the garden blooming wild and beautiful around them, was its own kind of answer to every question grief had ever asked her. The fluorescent lights of the boutique were long behind her now. What remained was something far better. A home rebuilt, a family healed, and a love that had found her not despite everything she'd lost, but because of the strength it had taken to survive it.